I wanted to make this into 4 separate parts, 4 separate videos, but I realized it would just take too much time, and I didn't want to spend the next 4 days talking about this subject. I was supposed to make part 1 yesterday, part 2 today, part 3 tomorrow, and part 4 on Tuesday. But I'm going to try to get it all in one go without making this video too long. The state of African football, I think 4 major things are going on right now that is holding Africa back at the moment. Number 1 is money makes the world go round. Specifically, a lot of African football federations and the 54-member association continent are financially unstable. Not enough money, not enough resources are going into these individual nations' federations to prop up their domestic leagues. And for the most part, players are underpaid. You saw the last World Cup with Ghana in 2014. There was a problem with players not getting paid on time. Africa always going through a problem with some of their nations not paying players properly, underfunding their football programs, both the domestic level and the national level. And that's a big problem because without money, let's face it, your mobility in the world, for that matter, in the economic free market, is limited. And same thing applies to the growth of the sport in all these countries. It's one of the reasons why most countries in Asia are behind the very best teams in Asia, why Oceania is well behind, due to not only just being small countries themselves, but just lacking the monetary means to build their football programs. So that's one big problem that Africa is having, is poverty. And poverty affects Africa at all levels, social, outside of football, and things that are much more important than football. Poverty, GDP, daily salary income. Africa has always had that problem, and it makes sense that problem leaks into its football associations. Usually, countries that are well-to-do financially perform well on the global stage, with the exception of a few. It's no secret the two are correlated, that's just how it is, unfortunately. A second problem that's hurting Africa and the current state of African football is corruption. There is massive corruption in individual African Football Association federation members. Cameroon, Ghana, bribery being a main thing. All these African representatives that a lot of these guys that work within FIFA for the African continent take home a large portion of the profits that are made, leaving, like I said, and the first problem facing these African associations, lack of money and resources. They get richer while the federations get poorer. So you have the kings of corruption within Africa. All these presidents of, the Cameroon, the Central African Republic, the Nigerian, every football association in Africa, and to one extent or another, is corrupt. And you have favoritism and bribery that goes on as well. An example, I hate to say it, but one of the most corrupt member associations in Africa is the Tunisian Football Federation. They have constantly lobbied and bribed the Confederation of African Football to favor them in draws for major tournaments. Tunisia were seeded as one of the 5 best African sides for the final round of African qualifying when they were nowhere near the top 5. Africa changed its seeding system for that last phase of World Cup qualifying at the last minute at Tunisia's behest, at their recommendation, so that they could be a seeded team. Because if they had used the old format of seeding them, Tunisia would not have been seeded. And the same thing happened in 2014 World Cup qualifying. Tunisia in the final round were seeded as one of the 5 best teams in Africa when they were clearly not. And they were given at that time an opponent who was one of the lowest ranked of the 10 sides still remaining, Cameroon. That backfired on Tunisia as Cameroon went on to qualify for the World Cup. But I'm not a very big fan of the Tunisian Football Federation. I think that they have stolen seeded spots in the last 2 World Cup cycles. And now they're on track to qualify for the World Cup with only DR Congo stopping them in their group. I don't know why Tunisia, being a soccer country that really hasn't done much in the last 10 years, why they were seeded as one of the best 5 sides in Africa in the last 2 World Cup qualifying cycles, including this one. But that's just one example. It's not just Tunisia. It's the entire continent. I cite Tunisia to give you an example. But as a whole, African football is subject to money schemes, favoritism, bribery, and honestly, some of the heads in power of each country's football federation really need to go because they're not doing anything to improve the overall quality of their country's domestic programs. The third problem with African football is the double-edged sword of European influence. And what I mean by that is this influx of European coaches into the African continent. Now, this has had a positive effect in the form of several decent European coaches that have led some African sides to success. Roger Lemaire for Tunisia back in 2004, Hervé Renard for both the Ivory Coast and Zambia. Those are examples of good European coaches in Africa, sure. But there's also a problem of mid-level, second and third tier quality coaches who otherwise could not get a job in Europe coming to Africa to coach all these national teams. And a lot of them hop in between different countries. There's one called Claude Leroy. He's a French coach known for coaching African sides, and he's coached anywhere around six to eight different African countries by now. He never really has a stable job. He just keeps hopping around. And the problem with thinking that any European coaching is the right solution has really been hurting Africa, because you should only put an emphasis on foreign influence, on foreign coaching, if you think that that coach could bring some positive developments to your national team. And those 2 examples I gave, Hervé Renard, Roger Lemaire, those are good coaches. They did some great things with African teams, led them to some titles. But then you have all of these, like I said, these European coaches who would not get hired anywhere else, coming in, introducing a new brand of football that Africans are not very familiar with, putting them off their rhythm, off their play, and they just stay rooted where they are. They just stay stagnant and no improvement is made. So the whole idea that European coaching in general needs to happen just because it's European, I think it's logically unsound. It's demonstrably false, because you have plenty of homegrown coaches in Africa that have done a brilliant job with their national teams. Stephen Keshi taking Nigeria to the 2013 African Cup of Nations title and to the round of 16 at the World Cup. And then you have the Democratic Republic of Congo's Florent Ibenge. He's another really great coach, poised to take DR Congo to their first ever World Cup under their new name. And then you also have Hassan Shehata, the former Egyptian manager, who took them to 3 consecutive African Cup of Nations titles in 2006, 2008, and 2010. So there is talent in Africa, not just on the field, but also on the sidelines as far as managers. I think Africa produces somewhat decent managers, and the criteria for managing a side in Africa should be not what continent they come from, but for their own merits. This whole idea that you have to have a European coach just because Europe is the creme de la creme, the cream of the crop of the best football on earth. It's just not true. And guys like Stephen Keshi and Florentine Benge have proved that wrong consistently. The fourth and final problem that's going on in Africa is, and this is bittersweet because it's a good and a bad thing at the same time, is the very best teams and the worst teams, the gap is narrowing. The gap is narrowing. What do I mean by that? Well, the last two World Cup cycles, you could say the best 4 or 5 best sides in Africa have been Cameroon, Nigeria, Algeria, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast, right? Now there's a new age paradigm shift taking place. And I noticed that this paradigm shift changes around every 10 to 12 years within Africa. We saw in the 2006 World Cup where 4 out of the 5 entrants entered their first ever World Cup compared to the 2002 World Cup participants. Only one team from 2002 made it to the 2006 World Cup, and that was Tunisia. And I think we could see something similar this time. I think we're gonna have 2 or 3 changes for the 2018 World Cup. 2 or 3 teams that make it that were not in the 2014 or 2010 editions. But what's happening right now is all the very best teams in Africa, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Algeria, they've sort of been in the decline a little bit. Nigeria, they're probably going to qualify for the World Cup because they are sitting in a comfortable position in their group. But Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Algeria, they've gone down. And not only that, you're now finally starting to see sides that we typically consider to be the minnows of Africa, like Swaziland, Comoros, Mauritania. They're getting results against the best teams. When's the last time you see Comoros getting a 0-0 or a 1-1 draw with Ghana? So the best teams, the bottom teams, are the bottom teams getting better or are the best teams getting worse? I think it's somewhere in between. I think they're both heading towards each other and the gap is ever increasingly narrowing. That's why ever since 2012, the African Cup of Nations has become very unpredictable because there are a lot of draws, a lot of 0-0, 1-1, 2-2 draws. Some teams will be eliminated with 3 draws after 3 games or advance with 3 draws after 3 games. The competition has gotten more competitive, but at the cost of games being a little bit less exciting and the fact that predicting the tournament has become much more volatile and difficult to call. Zambia winning in 2012 was unexpected, and it's sort of why teams like Ivory Coast, who have been praised as having a golden generation from the 2000s, really did not really win a major title until 2015 when they were very much on the downturn of their generation. Now Ivory Coast looks like absolute crap. Losing 5-0 in friendlies to the Netherlands and Russia. Not good. So I think there's a paradigm shift. I think we are seeing Africa coalesce. It's becoming harder to sort out who are the 4 or 5 best sides in the continent because the other teams, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and even 6th tier sides are moving up the ladder, and it's just very difficult to call. My opinion, the best teams in Africa right now, I think the 5 best teams in Africa right now, I think the best team is Senegal. I think it's Senegal. I think their African Cup of Nations performance back in January, February was not really reflective of their overall quality. I thought Cameroon was very fortunate to beat them on penalties. Cameroon, I think, is number 2. Number 3, honestly, I think it's us. I think it's Egypt. I think we have come back after years away in the wilderness. I think we're number 3. Number 4, I think it's Burkina Faso, Les Italiens, the Stallions of Burkina Faso. And the 5th best team in Africa, probably Nigeria. But notice in those 5 teams that I just said, only 2 of them were in the previous World Cup, right? So there is a shift going on where the golden generations of Ghana and Ivory Coast, so to speak, are dwindling or at least almost gone. and you're seeing the rise of better teams. Now, why is that happening? I think it's bittersweet because the worst teams are getting better, but the best teams are also getting worse. And I think one of the main culprits for that is the fact that you have so many of the best players in Africa that are getting deals to play in Europe. These African players, they go over, they play in Europe, and they gain European experience, but the European brand of football is fundamentally different than the brand that is played in Africa. So they go to Europe, they learn how to play European football, and then they come back and they play for their national teams in Africa, whether it's in an African Cup of Nations or in a World Cup, and they just look so out of balance. They just look so lost because they're so used to playing the new brand of European football that doesn't fit African football's identity, because Africa plays a different brand of football. You go on and you look how Germany, how in Italy, how France play, how in England plays, how Spain, Portugal, and you watch Africans play. It's different. Their approach to the game is different. The psychology is just different. And when these African players go play in Europe, sure, they're getting European existence. Sure, they're playing for the best clubs in the world. Sure, they're getting better. But when they come home and they play with their countrymen in their country, their form is just out of whack. It's just not the same. So it's bittersweet. Those are really the 4 or 5 problems I see within African football today. Lack of money, corruption, European influence being a good and bad thing, and the paradigm shift of the gap in talent and quality is getting narrower and narrower, making Africa the most difficult continent in the world to predict for World Cup qualifiers. So thank you for watching this video. Leave a comment below, like, subscribe. Till then, guys, have a good day. Much love. Peace out.